The parking lot of Miller's Hardware was nearly empty that Tuesday afternoon when I heard something that would haunt me for weeks. I was loading paint cans into my truck, the kind of mundane errand that fills retirement days, when old Frank Kowalski approached me with that look people get when they're carrying bad news they're not sure they should share. Frank had known our family for 30 years. He'd watched my son David grow up, seen him graduate high school, get married, and start his own landscaping business. So, when Frank cleared his throat and glanced around nervously before speaking, I knew whatever he was about to say mattered. "Eleanor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I've been debating whether to tell you this for weeks now. But if it were my boy, I'd want to know." My hands stilled on the paint can. Frank wasn't one for gossip or drama. In all the years I'd known him, he'd never once spread rumors or involved himself in other people's business. The fact that he was approaching me now sent a chill down my spine. "What is it, Frank?" He looked around again, then stepped closer. "It's about David. I've seen him at the Riverside Tavern multiple times. Always alone, always drinking heavily. Last week, I watched him stumble to his car around 2 in the afternoon. Eleanor, he was in no condition to drive." The words hit me like a physical blow. My David, my responsible, hardworking son, who'd never so much as gotten a speeding ticket, drinking and driving in the middle of the day. It seemed impossible. "You must be mistaken," I said automatically. "David doesn't drink much. A beer with dinner sometimes, maybe a glass of wine on special occasions. And he would never drink and drive." "Never." Frank's weathered face showed nothing but compassion. I hoped I was wrong, too. That's why I waited so long to say anything. But I've seen him there 4 different times now, always midday, always leaving in his truck. The bartender knows him by name. I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. Frank had no reason to lie, no motivation to hurt me or my family. But the man he was describing bore no resemblance to the son I thought I knew. "Are you certain it was David?" "Eleanor, I've known that boy since he was 10 years old." It was him. I thanked Frank and finished loading my car in a daze, my mind reeling with questions and disbelief. During the 15-minute drive home, I ran through every conversation I'd had with David in recent months, searching for signs I might have missed. Had he seemed different? More stressed? Had there been any indication that something was wrong? David called me every Sunday evening, just as he had for the past 8 years since his divorce. Our conversations were always pleasant, filled with updates about his business, stories about his clients, and plans for upcoming visits. He'd sounded tired lately, perhaps a bit distracted, but I'd attributed that to the busy season. Landscaping work picked up in spring and summer, and David had always been conscientious about providing excellent service to his customers. But now Frank's words echoed in my mind, casting every recent interaction in a different light. Had David's voice sounded different during our last call? Had he been slurring slightly, or was I imagining things in retrospect? When he'd canceled our usual Saturday lunch 2 weeks ago, claiming he had an emergency job, had that been the truth? The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. My son had built a successful business from nothing, working 18-hour days in the beginning, gradually building a reputation for reliability and quality. His divorce had been difficult, but he'd handled it with dignity, never bad-mouthing his ex-wife, focusing on providing for his teenage daughter Emma, even when money was tight. The David I knew would never jeopardize everything he'd worked for by drinking and driving. He'd never risk his license, his business, his life. And yet, Frank Kowalski wasn't the type of man to fabricate stories. If he said he'd seen David drinking and driving, then he'd seen David drinking and driving. By the time I reached my house, I'd made a decision that both terrified and shamed me. I was going to verify Frank's story, not because I wanted to spy on my son, but because I needed to know if the man I'd raised and loved was in trouble. If David was struggling with something serious enough to drive him to drink during work hours, then he needed help, not judgment. The thought of conducting surveillance on my own child made me sick to my stomach. What kind of mother doesn't trust her son? What kind of relationship had we built if he felt he couldn't come to me with his problems? But Frank's concern had been genuine, and I couldn't shake the image of David stumbling to his truck, putting himself and innocent people at risk. I spent the rest of the evening researching the Riverside Tavern online. It was a small establishment on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that attracted regulars rather than casual customers. The reviews mentioned a relaxed atmosphere, reasonable prices, and a bartender named Mike who'd been there for over a decade. Not the sort of place I would have imagined my son frequenting, which somehow made Frank's story more believable. That night, I barely slept. I kept picturing David as a little boy, so earnest and eager to please, always trying to do the right thing. He'd been the kind of child who returned lost wallets to their owners and volunteered to help elderly neighbors with their groceries. Even as a teenager, when most kids were pushing boundaries and testing limits, David had remained steady and responsible. His marriage to Jennifer had seemed solid for the first few years. They'd bought a house, started the landscaping business together, and welcomed Emma into their lives with joy and enthusiasm. But cracks had appeared gradually, small disagreements that grew into fundamental incompatibilities. Jennifer had wanted David to sell the business and find a real job with benefits and regular hours. She'd grown tired of the seasonal income fluctuations, the physical demands of the work, and the way David came home exhausted and dirty every day. The divorce had been finalized 3 years ago, but I could see it still affected David deeply. He'd thrown himself into work with even more intensity afterward, perhaps trying to prove something to himself or to Jennifer, or maybe just seeking the kind of exhaustion that makes sleep come easier. He'd maintained joint custody of Emma, and those weekends when she stayed with him were the only times I saw him truly relaxed and happy. But Emma was 17 now, busy with her senior year, college applications, and a social life that left little time for weekend visits with Dad. I'd noticed David seemed lonelier lately, though he'd never admitted it directly. When I'd suggested he start dating again, he'd laughed and said he was too busy, too tired, too set in his ways for romance. Maybe that loneliness was what had driven him to the Riverside Tavern. The next morning, I made a decision that felt both necessary and deeply wrong. I would drive to the tavern around lunchtime and see for myself whether Frank's observations were accurate. I told myself this wasn't spying, it was concern. If David was there, if he was drinking heavily during work hours, then clearly something was very wrong, and as his mother, I had both the right and the responsibility to know about it. I spent the morning cleaning house obsessively, trying to keep my hands busy while my mind churned with anxiety and doubt. Part of me hoped Frank had been mistaken, that he'd seen someone who merely resembled David, that my son was exactly who I believed him to be. But another part of me, the part that had raised David and knew his moods and habits better than anyone, was already beginning to accept that something had changed. At 11:30, I drove to the Riverside Tavern. The building was smaller than I'd expected, a converted house with a hand-painted sign and a gravel parking lot that needed fresh stone. 3 pickup trucks sat outside, along with an older sedan and a motorcycle. I parked across the street behind a delivery van where I could observe without being seen. The minutes crawled by. I watched people come and go, mostly men in work clothes, grabbing lunch and a quick beer before returning to their jobs. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested the kind of serious drinking problem Frank had described. Maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe David had just stopped by for lunch on those occasions, and Frank had misinterpreted what he'd seen. Then, at 12:15, David's white pickup truck pulled into the lot. My heart sank as I watched my son climb out of the driver's seat. Even from a distance, something seemed off about his movements. He walked with the careful deliberation of someone trying to appear more sober than they actually were. His shoulders had a defeated slump I'd never seen before, and when he paused before entering the tavern, he looked around the parking lot with what seemed like shame. This was not the David I knew. This was not the confident businessman who'd built a successful company from nothing, the devoted father who never missed Emma's school events, the son who called me every Sunday without fail. This was a stranger wearing my son's face, and the sight of him broke my heart. I sat in my car for over 2 hours, watching David's truck remain motionless in that parking lot. Other vehicles came and went, people grabbing quick lunches or meeting friends for afternoon drinks, but David's truck stayed put. At 2:30, I finally saw him emerge from the tavern, and Frank's description proved disturbingly accurate. David walked with the exaggerated care of someone who knew they were impaired, but was trying to hide it. He fumbled with his keys, dropped them once, then stood by his truck for several minutes, as if gathering courage or waiting for the world to stop spinning. When he finally climbed into the driver's seat, I felt physically sick. I followed him at a distance, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. David drove slowly, carefully, but there were subtle signs of impairment that terrified me. He took turns too wide, stopped too abruptly at red lights, and once drifted slightly into the next lane before correcting his position. We were lucky the roads were relatively empty, but luck wouldn't protect him forever. He drove to a residential neighborhood I didn't recognize and pulled into the driveway of a modest ranch house. I parked at the end of the block and watched him sit in his truck for nearly 10 minutes before getting out. His movements were deliberate but unsteady, and he had to use the truck for support as he walked to the front door. A woman answered his knock, someone I'd never seen before. She was attractive, probably in her 40s, with shoulder-length blonde hair and a concerned expression. They talked briefly on the porch, and I could see her gesturing, perhaps arguing. David's body language was defensive, his hands moving in the way they always had when he was trying to justify something he knew was wrong. After about 5 minutes, the woman stepped back and David returned to his truck. But instead of leaving, he sat there with his head in his hands. Even from my distant vantage point, I could see his shoulders shaking, and I realized with horror that my son was crying. The woman came out again, this time approaching the truck. She opened the passenger door and got in, and they sat together for another 20 minutes. I couldn't see their faces clearly, but their body language suggested an intense, emotional conversation. Finally, she got out, squeezed David's shoulder through the open window, and returned to her house. David drove away slowly, and I followed at a safe distance. He went to a strip mall and parked outside a small office building. From the sign, I could see it housed several businesses, including a counseling center. David sat in his truck for another 10 minutes, then got out and walked inside. This discovery shifted everything. David wasn't just drinking heavily during work hours. He was seeing a counselor. The woman at the house might be a friend, a sponsor, someone trying to help him through whatever crisis he was facing. The careful way he'd been driving suggested he was aware of his impairment and was trying to be responsible despite his poor judgment in getting behind the wheel at all. I drove home in a state of emotional turmoil. On one hand, I was relieved to discover that David was apparently seeking help for whatever problems he was facing. On the other hand, I was devastated that my son was struggling so deeply that he needed professional counseling and that he felt he couldn't confide in me about any of it. That evening, I called Emma. If anyone would know what was happening with David, it would be his daughter. They had always been close, and even with her busy schedule, she still made time for regular phone calls with her father. "Hi, Grandma Eleanor." Emma's voice was bright but tired. How are you doing? I'm fine, sweetheart. How's your father? Has he seemed different to you lately? There was a long pause, and when Emma spoke again, her voice was more cautious. Different how? Just stressed, maybe. Distracted. I'm worried about him. Another pause. Grandma, has someone said something to you about Dad? The question caught me off guard. Emma's tone suggested she knew more than she was saying, that perhaps she'd been expecting this conversation. Why would you ask that? Because I've been worried about him too. He's been canceling our dinners, making excuses not to see me. And when we do talk, he sounds, I don't know, sad. Really sad. My conversation with Emma lasted nearly an hour, and by the end, I had a clearer picture of what David was going through, though many questions remained unanswered. Emma confirmed that her father had been different for months, increasingly withdrawn and unreliable about their plans together. She'd attributed it to work stress initially, but lately she'd begun to suspect something more serious was happening. The last time I saw him, about 3 weeks ago, he looked terrible, Emma said, her voice heavy with worry. He'd lost weight, his eyes were bloodshot, and he kept checking his phone every few minutes like he was expecting bad news. When I asked if everything was okay, he just said business was slow, and he was worried about making ends meet. This surprised me. David's landscaping company had always been successful, with a steady roster of commercial accounts and wealthy residential clients who paid premium rates for his services. Even during the divorce, when legal fees had strained his finances, David had never expressed serious concern about money. Did he say anything specific about the business problems? I asked Emma. Not really. Just that some big clients had canceled their contracts, and he was having trouble finding new ones. But Grandma, when I drove past his office last week, there were 3 work trucks in the lot and guys loading equipment. If business was really that bad, would he still have all those employees? Emma's observation aligned with my own confusion. If David was genuinely facing financial difficulties severe enough to cause the kind of stress that drove him to drinking, wouldn't there be more obvious signs? Wouldn't he have mentioned it during our weekly phone calls, perhaps asked for advice or even financial help if things were truly desperate? After hanging up with Emma, I spent the evening researching addiction and alcoholism online. What I learned both frightened and enlightened me. Functional alcoholics could maintain their professional responsibilities for years while their personal lives deteriorated in secret. The progression from occasional stress drinking to physical dependence could happen gradually, almost imperceptibly, especially for someone like David, who lived alone and worked independently. The articles described warning signs I now recognized in retrospect: the canceled social plans, the isolation from family, the mood swings Emma and I had attributed to other causes. David had always been private about his personal struggles, even as a child. When other kids would come running to me with scraped knees or hurt feelings, David would retreat to his room until he'd composed himself, then emerge acting as if nothing had happened. Perhaps his current crisis was following the same pattern. Perhaps he was struggling with something so overwhelming that his usual coping mechanisms had failed, driving him to seek solace in alcohol and eventually professional counseling. The question that tormented me was whether he was getting the right kind of help, and whether there was anything I could do to support him without making the situation worse. The next morning, I made a decision that felt both intrusive and necessary. I would return to the Riverside Tavern not to spy on David, but to speak with the bartender Frank had mentioned. If Davy were truly a regular customer, this Mike person would have observed his behavior over time. He might have insights into David's state of mind, or at least be able to confirm whether my son's drinking had reached dangerous levels. The Riverside Tavern looked different in daylight than it had during my surveillance the previous day. The interior was dimmer than I'd expected, with wood paneling that had darkened with age and smoke. A handful of patrons sat at the bar and in booths along the walls, most of them middle-aged men who looked like they worked with their hands for a living. The atmosphere was more melancholy than hostile, filled with people seeking quiet companionship rather than rowdy entertainment. The bartender was a stocky man in his 50s with graying hair and tired eyes that suggested he'd heard every sob story ever invented. When I approached the bar and asked to speak with Mike, he looked at me with polite curiosity. "I'm Mike," he said, setting down the glass he'd been cleaning. "What can I do for you?" "I'm Eleanor Hartley," I said, my voice shakier than I'd intended. "I believe you know my son David?" Mike's expression immediately became more guarded. "David Hartley? Yeah, I know now, David. Is everything okay?" "That's what I'm trying to find out. A friend told me David's been coming here regularly, and that he's been drinking heavily. I'm concerned about him." Mike studied my face for a long moment, clearly weighing his response carefully. Bartenders, I realized, probably dealt with worried family members more often than I'd considered. "Mrs. Hartley," he said finally, "I like David. He's a good guy who's going through a rough patch. But I can't discuss a customer's drinking habits with his mother, even if you mean well." "That's not right." I'd expected this response, but I pressed on anyway. "I'm not asking you to betray his confidence. I just need to know if he's in danger. If he's drinking and driving, if he's putting himself or other people at risk." Mike's expression softened slightly. "Look, I can't tell you specifics about David's visits here, but I can tell you this: when someone's in real trouble, really spiraling, you can see it in their eyes, in the way they carry themselves. David's hurting. That's obvious to anyone who talks to him for more than 5 minutes. But he's not spiraling. He's fighting." "Fighting what?" "That's not for me to say. But Mrs. Hartley, if you're worried about your son, maybe you should try talking to him directly instead of asking strangers for information." Mike's gentle rebuke stung because it was accurate. I was trying to gather intelligence about David's problems without actually confronting the uncomfortable reality that my relationship with my son had somehow deteriorated to the point where he felt he couldn't confide in me. When had I become someone he needed to hide things from? I thanked Mike and left the tavern feeling more confused than before. His words suggested that David was dealing with something specific, something serious enough to drive him to drinking, but not so overwhelming that he'd lost hope entirely. The fact that he was seeing a counselor supported Mike's assessment that David was fighting rather than surrendering to whatever crisis he faced. That afternoon, I called David's office and spoke with Maria, the woman who handled his scheduling and billing. I'd met her several times over the years and knew she was both competent and discreet. If anyone would know about problems with the business, it would be Maria. "Oh, hello, Mrs. Hartley," Maria said warmly. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine, thank you." "Maria, I hope you don't mind me asking, but how's business been lately?" David mentioned some concerns about client cancellations. There was a pause, and when Maria spoke again, her tone was more careful. "The business is doing fine, Mrs. Hartley. We're actually busier than usual this season. Several new commercial accounts, plus all our regular residential clients." I'm not sure what David meant about cancellations. This contradiction deepened my confusion. If the business was thriving, why had David told Emma they were facing financial difficulties? Why would he lie to his own daughter about something so fundamental? Unless the problem wasn't business-related at all, and David had simply offered a convenient excuse to explain his obvious distress. After ending the call with Maria, I sat in my kitchen staring at the phone, trying to decide what to do next. Every piece of information I gathered seemed to contradict something else, creating a puzzle I couldn't solve from the outside. Frank had seen David drinking heavily during work hours. I'd witnessed him driving while impaired and visiting a counselor. Emma had noticed dramatic changes in his behavior and appearance. But according to his office manager, the business was successful, and according to the bartender, David was struggling with something specific rather than simply falling apart. The only way to get real answers was to confront David directly, but I was terrified of destroying what remained of our relationship. What if my investigation had already crossed lines I couldn't uncross? What if David discovered I'd been following him, questioning his employees and the people he'd interacted with? Would he see my actions as concern or betrayal? That evening, I made the hardest decision I'd faced as a parent since David was a teenager, caught shoplifting candy from the corner store. I was going to call him directly and ask him to meet me for dinner. No more surveillance, no more questioning other people about his behavior. If my Wern was in crisis, I needed to hear it from him. David answered on the third ring, and immediately I could hear the difference in his voice. Where once there had been warmth and energy, now there was a flatness that spoke of exhaustion deeper than physical tiredness. "Hi, Mom," he said, and I could hear him trying to inject enthusiasm into his tone. "How are you doing?" "I'm fine, sweetheart. But I'm worried about you. Could we have dinner together this week?" "Just the two of us." The pause that followed stretched uncomfortably long. "This week's pretty busy, Mom. We've got several big jobs wrapping up, and you know how crazy things get when clients want everything finished before their parties or events." Another lie. According to Maria, the business was busy but not unusually so. David was avoiding me, just as he'd been avoiding Emma. The realization hurt more than I'd expected. "David," I said, abandoning subtlety, "I know something's wrong. I can hear it in your voice, and Emma's noticed changes too. Please don't shut me out. Whatever's happening, we can figure it out together." The silence this time was even longer, and when David finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "Mom, some things can't be figured out. Some mistakes can't be fixed." "What kind of mistake?" "David, you're scaring me. I can't talk about this over the phone. And I can't have dinner with you right now because I'm not fit company for anyone, especially not you." "Then let me come to you. I'll bring takeout and we can eat at your house. I just need to see you, to know you're okay." "I'm not okay." The admission came out like a confession. I haven't been okay for months, and I don't know how to fix it. My heart broke for the pain in his voice, but I also felt a surge of relief that he was finally being honest with me. "You don't have to fix everything by yourself. That's what family is for." "This is different, Mom. This is something I did. Something I caused. And the person I hurt the most is someone you care about?" A chill ran down my spine. "Who, David? Who did you hurt?" "Emma." His voice cracked on her name. "I hurt Emma, and I don't think she'll ever forgive me. I don't think I deserve forgiveness." The pieces began falling into place with sickening clarity. Emma's recent distance from her father, her careful questions about whether someone had said something to me about David, and the way she'd described his appearance the last time she'd seen him. Something had happened between David and Emma, something serious enough to drive him to drinking and counseling. What happened with Emma? David's breathing was ragged, and I could hear him struggling to maintain composure. "I can't tell you over the phone. It's too important, too complicated. But Mom, I want you to know that whatever Emma tells you about me, she's not exaggerating. She's probably being kinder than I deserve. David, whatever happened, it can be worked through. You and Emma love each other. She's your daughter. That's what makes it so much worse." His voice broke completely. "She trusted me, and I let her down in the worst possible way. I failed her as a father, and I failed you as a son." The line went quiet except for the sound of David crying, something I hadn't heard since he was a child. I sat in my kitchen holding the phone with trembling hands, trying to imagine what could have happened between father and daughter that would cause this level of devastation. David, I'm coming over. Right now. We're going to talk about this face to face. No, Mom. Please. I need more time to figure out how to explain this. And I need to talk to Emma first. She deserves to hear my apology before anyone else gets involved. Have you tried to apologize to her? She won't take my calls. She won't answer my texts. I drove to her apartment last week, but she wouldn't come to the door. Her roommate told me Emma asked me not to come back. The situation was worse than I'd imagined. Emma was actively avoiding David, which suggested something far more serious than a simple misunderstanding or argument. My granddaughter was mature beyond her years, not given to dramatic overreactions or holding grudges over minor issues. If she was refusing to speak to her father, something genuinely terrible had occurred. What about Jennifer? Have you talked to Emma's mother about this? David laughed bitterly. Jennifer knows. Emma told her everything. Jennifer called me 3 weeks ago and said that if I ever tried to contact Emma again, she'd get a restraining order. She said, I was lucky Emma wasn't pressing charges. Pressing charges. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. What had David done that could potentially result in criminal charges? My mind raced through possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. Had there been some kind of accident? Had David hurt Emma physically? Had his drinking led to some terrible mistake that had endangered her? David, did you hurt Emma? Physically, I mean. Not the way you're thinking. But yes, I hurt her. I betrayed her trust in the worst possible way, and she has every right to hate me. I don't understand what that means. It means I'm a failure as a father and as a human being. It means the most important person in my life can't stand the sight of me, and it's entirely my fault. David's self-recrimination was so intense it frightened me. Whatever had happened, he was drowning in guilt and shame. The drinking, the counseling, the isolation from family all made sense now as desperate attempts to cope with overwhelming remorse. Sweetheart, I need you to listen to me. Whatever happened, it doesn't change the fact that you're my son and I love you. It doesn't change the fact that Emma loves you too, even if she's hurt and angry right now. You don't know what I did, Mom. When you find out, you won't feel the same way about me. Try me. There was another long pause, and when David spoke again, his voice was barely audible. I stole from her. I stole money from Emma's college fund. Money she'd been saving from her part-time job. Money you and Jennifer had contributed. Money she needed for her senior year expenses and graduation fees. I took almost all of it. The admission hit me like a punch to the stomach. David had stolen from his own daughter, violated the trust of a child who had always adored him. But even as I processed the shock and disappointment, part of my mind was already working to understand how this could have happened. The David I knew would never steal from Emma, would never jeopardize her education or future. Something had driven him to this desperate act. How much money? $8,000. She had almost $9,000 saved up, and I left her with $1,200. I told myself I was borrowing it, that I'd pay it back before she noticed. But the investments I made with it failed, and now I can't replace it. Emma needed the money for her cap and gown, her senior photos, graduation announcements, and the deposit for her dorm room. She had to ask Jennifer for help, and that's when everything came out. Now, I understood Emma's recent behavior, her careful questions about her father, her obvious worry mixed with something I'd interpreted as typical teenage business, but now recognized as hurt and betrayal. My granddaughter had discovered that her father, the man she'd trusted most in the world, had stolen her carefully saved money. David, why did you need $8,000? What kind of investments? Stupid ones. Desperate ones. I got involved with some people who promised guaranteed returns and quick profits. I thought I could double Emma's money and put it back before anyone knew it was gone. Instead, I lost everything. The gambling connection explained everything, and nothing made sense at the same time. David had always been cautious with money, almost to a fault. Even as a teenager, he'd saved every dollar from part-time jobs and gifts, planning for the future with an intensity that sometimes worried me. The idea that he would risk his daughter's college fund on investment schemes seemed completely out of character. David, when did this start? The gambling, the investments, whatever you want to call them? His voice was hollow when he answered. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized. I was lonely, angry, and feeling like I'd failed at everything that mattered. A client mentioned this online trading platform where you could make quick money on cryptocurrency fluctuations. He showed me screenshots of his profits, thousands of dollars made in a single day. I closed my eyes, recognizing the classic pattern of how people get drawn into risky schemes. Emotional vulnerability combined with the promise of easy money, testimonials from trusted sources, and the illusion of control over outcomes that were actually random. At first, I only used my own money, David continued. Small amounts just to see how it worked. And I won, Mom. The first few trades were incredibly successful. I made $3,000 in 2 weeks. It felt like I'd discovered a secret that other people were too scared or too ignorant to take advantage of. But then you started losing. Not right away. The wins kept coming for almost a month. I was making more money trading than I was making with the landscaping business. I started thinking about quitting the physical work entirely, becoming a full-time trader. I researched strategies, joined online forums, and convinced myself I was getting good at reading market patterns. The progression was predictable and heartbreaking. David had experienced the classic gambling addiction cycle, early wins creating confidence, increased stakes leading to bigger wins and bigger losses, the desperate chase to recover losses with even riskier bets. When did you first use Emma's money? 3 months ago. I'd lost everything I'd won, plus about $5,000 of my own savings. I was in what the traders call a drawdown period, which is just a fancy way of saying I was losing consistently. But I'd studied the patterns, learned from my mistakes. I convinced myself that one big smart trade would recover everything I'd lost and put me back in profit. And you thought you could replace Emma's money before she needed it. She wasn't starting college until fall. I figured I had 4 months to turn $8,000 into $16,000, replace what I'd borrowed, and still have a substantial profit. It seemed like a reasonable plan. Nothing about risking a teenager's college fund on cryptocurrency speculation was reasonable, but I could hear in David's voice that he genuinely believed his own rationalization at the time. Addiction creates its own logic, its own justification system that makes terrible decisions seem not just acceptable, but necessary. What happened when you lost Emma's money? I panicked. I tried to win it back with credit card cash advances, a loan against my truck, and even money I took from the business account. Every loss made me more desperate to recover everything with one successful trade. I kept thinking the next trade would be the one that fixed everything. How much did you lose in total? David was quiet for so long I thought the connection had dropped. When he finally answered, his voice was barely audible. Around $30,000. The business is struggling now because I took money from accounts that should have been used for equipment maintenance and employee payroll. I'm behind on my mortgage, my truck payment, everything. The scope of David's financial destruction was staggering. He hadn't just stolen from Emma, he'd systematically dismantled his own financial stability, chasing losses with more losses. The successful business Maria had described was apparently being held together through David's desperate juggling of accounts and obligations. David, you need help. Professional help. This isn't something you can solve on your own. I know. That's why I've been seeing Dr. Martinez. She specializes in gambling addiction. We meet twice a week, and I've been attending online support group meetings. I've been sober from trading for 6 weeks now. Relief flooded through me at this admission. David was getting appropriate help, and 6 weeks of abstinence from gambling was a significant achievement for someone with a serious addiction. But sobriety was only the beginning of recovery. The damage to his relationships and finances would take much longer to repair. What about Emma? Have you tried writing her a letter explaining what happened and why? Dr. Martinez suggested that too. I've written probably 20 different letters, but none of them seem adequate. How do you explain to your daughter that you stole her money to feed an addiction she didn't even know you had? How do you ask for forgiveness for something unforgivable? By being completely honest about everything. By taking full responsibility without making excuses. By showing her that you're getting help and that you understand the magnitude of what you did. What if she never forgives me? What if I've destroyed our relationship permanently? The pain in David's voice was devastating, but I forced myself to give him an honest answer, rather than empty reassurance. That's possible. Emma has every right to be angry and hurt. She has every right to decide she can't trust you again. But you can't control her response, David. You can only control your own actions going forward. Dr. Martinez says the same thing. Focus on recovery, focus on making amends where possible, focus on becoming the person I want to be, regardless of whether Emma ever forgives me. Dr. Martinez sounds wise. Are you following her advice? I'm trying. Some days are better than others. The hardest part isn't resisting the urge to gamble anymore. It's living with the shame of what I did to Emma. She trusted me completely, and I violated that trust in the worst possible way. I could hear David beginning to spiral into the kind of self-loathing that Dr. Martinez was probably working to address in their sessions. While his guilt was appropriate and necessary, excessive shame could become its own destructive force, potentially driving him back to addictive behaviors as a form of escape. David, you made a terrible mistake that hurt someone you love deeply. That's true, and you need to accept responsibility for it. But you're also taking steps to address the underlying problem and prevent it from happening again. That counts for something. Does it, though? Emma's college fund is still gone. Her senior year is ruined because she has to work extra hours instead of focusing on her studies. Jennifer had to take money from her retirement account to cover Emma's expenses. All the people I love are suffering because of my choices. And you're in recovery working with a professional, attending support groups? You're facing the problem instead of running from it. That's nothing, David. The conversation continued for another hour, with David alternating between moments of hope and periods of deep despair. I began to understand why he'd been avoiding family contact. The shame and guilt were so overwhelming that facing the people he'd hurt felt unbearable. The drinking at the Riverside Tavern wasn't just about numbing emotional pain, it was about punishing himself for his perceived failures. By the time we hung up, I had a much clearer picture of the crisis that had devastated my son's life. But I also had new concerns about Emma, who was dealing with her own trauma from her father's betrayal. My granddaughter needed support too, and I wasn't sure she was getting it. The next morning, I called Emma directly. The conversation with David had left me deeply concerned about my granddaughter's emotional state, and I needed to understand how she was processing her father's betrayal. Emma had always been resilient, but discovering that her beloved father had stolen from her would test anyone's ability to cope. Emma answered on the first ring, as if she'd been expecting my call. "Hi, Grandma. I guess you talked to Dad." "I did." "Emma, I'm so sorry about what happened. I can't imagine how hurt and confused you must be feeling." "I keep thinking I should have seen it coming somehow," Emma said, her voice steady but tired. Looking back, there were signs. Dad seemed stressed whenever we talked about college expenses. He kept suggesting I apply for more financial aid, look into cheaper schools, and consider taking a gap year. At the time, I thought he was just being practical. You couldn't have known what he was planning. Parents are supposed to protect their children's futures, not jeopardize them. That's what makes it so hard to understand. Dad always taught me to save money, to be responsible, and to think about long-term consequences before making decisions. He helped me set up that savings account when I was 14. We used to joke about watching the balance grow, planning how I'd use the money for college. The betrayal was even more painful because David had been instrumental in teaching Emma the financial responsibility he'd then violated. He'd helped her develop the very savings discipline that had made her college fund possible, only to steal the fruits of her labor when his own discipline failed. "How are you managing financially? Your father mentioned that Jennifer had to help cover your expenses." Mom dipped into her retirement savings to replace most of what Dad took. "She's been amazing, but I know it hurt her financially. She was planning to reduce her work hours next year, maybe take some art classes she's always wanted to try. Now she'll have to work full-time indefinitely to rebuild what she lost helping me." The ripple effects of David's actions were expanding beyond just father and daughter. Jennifer, who had already suffered through the emotional and financial costs of divorce, was now sacrificing her own retirement security to clean up her ex-husband's mess. The injustice of it made me angry on behalf of both Emma and Jennifer. "What about your college plans? Are you still able to start in the fall as scheduled?" "Barely. I qualified for some emergency financial aid after explaining the situation to the admissions office. It was humiliating having to tell strangers that my father stole my college money to gamble online. But the financial aid counselor was understanding. She said family financial crises are more common than people think." I admired Emma's practical approach to solving her problem, but I could hear the exhaustion beneath her composed exterior. At 17, she shouldn't have been dealing with adult problems like financial aid appeals and family addiction issues. "How are you doing emotionally? This can't be easy to process." "Some days are better than others. I'm seeing a counselor too, someone Mom found who specializes in family trauma. She's helping me understand that Dad's choices don't reflect anything I did wrong, but it's still hard not to feel somehow responsible." "Responsible how?" I keep thinking about all the times I talked about college, about my plans, about how excited I was to use my savings for something important. Maybe I put too much pressure on Dad to help me financially. Maybe I should have been more independent, gotten more scholarships, not relied on family money at all. Emma's tendency to blame herself was heartbreaking and entirely predictable. Children often internalize responsibility for their parents' failures, especially when those failures directly impact them. The fact that she was working with a counselor was encouraging, but I wanted to reinforce the message that David's addiction and theft were his responsibility alone. "Emma, your father's gambling problem started long before he touched your college fund. He made a series of choices that had nothing to do with you or your needs. You were being a normal teenager, excited about college and grateful for family support. There's nothing wrong with that. I know that intellectually. My counselor says the same thing. But emotionally, it's harder to accept. I trusted Dad completely. Even after the divorce, when Mom was angry with him, I always defended him. I thought he was the most honest, reliable person I knew. He was for most of your life. Addiction changes people, makes them do things that contradict their fundamental values. That doesn't excuse what he did, but it might help explain how someone you knew to be honest could make such dishonest choices. Have you forgiven him? The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on understanding the situation and supporting both David and Emma that I hadn't really examined my own feelings about my son's actions. I'm not sure forgiveness is the right word yet, I said honestly. I love your father, and I understand that he's sick. But I'm also angry about what he did to you, to Jennifer, to himself. I think forgiveness might be something that happens over time, as he proves through his actions that he's truly committed to recovery. Mom says I don't have to forgive him at all if I don't want to. That forgiveness isn't required even from daughters to fathers. Your mother is right. Forgiveness is a gift, not an obligation. You have every right to protect yourself emotionally, even if that means maintaining distance from your father indefinitely. But what if I want to forgive him eventually? What if I miss having a relationship with him? Emma's question revealed the internal conflict that was probably tormenting her daily. She was simultaneously hurt by her father's betrayal and grieving the loss of the relationship they'd shared. The love didn't disappear just because trust had been broken, which made the situation more complicated and painful. Then you'll figure that out when you're ready. There's no timeline for processing this kind of hurt. You might feel differently in 6 months, or a year, or 5 years. Or you might not. Both outcomes are valid. Dad's been trying to contact me. Calls, texts, emails, and even letters left at my apartment door. I haven't responded to any of them, but I have read some of the letters. How do they make you feel? Sad mostly. He sounds so guilty and ashamed. Part of me wants to call him and tell him it's okay, that I understand he's sick and didn't mean to hurt me. But another part of me thinks that would be letting him off too easily. Emma was wrestling with the complexity of loving someone who had caused her significant harm. The desire to comfort her father conflicted with her need to protect herself and acknowledge the seriousness of his actions. You don't have to choose between compassion and boundaries. You can feel sorry for your father's suffering while still maintaining distance until you feel ready for contact. Empathy doesn't require forgiveness, and forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation. My counselor says something similar. She talks about holding multiple truths at the same time. Dad is sick and needs help, and he also made choices that hurt me deeply. Both things can be true. That sounds like a wise counselor. She is. She's also helping me figure out how to rebuild my ability to trust people. Right now, I find myself questioning everyone's motives, wondering if other people in my life are hiding things or lying about important stuff. This was one of the most insidious effects of betrayal by a trusted family member. Emma's fundamental sense of safety and predictability in relationships had been damaged, potentially affecting her ability to form healthy connections with friends, romantic partners, and even other family members. Over the following weeks, I found myself caught between my love for David and my protective instincts toward Emma. Both of them were suffering, both needed support, but their needs seemed to conflict with each other. David desperately wanted to make amends and rebuild his relationship with his daughter, while Emma needed space and time to process the betrayal without pressure to reconcile. I decided to focus on what I could control, being available to both of them without trying to orchestrate their relationship with each other. This meant listening to David's progress in recovery without pushing him to contact Emma, and supporting Emma's healing process without pressuring her to forgive her father. Dr. Martinez, David's counselor, agreed to meet with me to discuss how I could best support my son's recovery. Her office was in a modest professional building, decorated with calming colors and inspirational quotes about resilience and growth. Dr. Martinez herself was a petite woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a direct manner that inspired confidence. "David has told me a lot about you, Mrs. Hartley," she said as we settled into comfortable chairs. "He feels tremendous guilt about disappointing you, in addition to his remorse about Emma. I'm more concerned about his recovery than my disappointment. What can I do to help him stay committed to treatment? The most important thing is to avoid enabling while still showing support. That means not giving him money, not making excuses for his past behavior, but also not withdrawing your love or cutting off communication entirely." Dr. Martinez explained that family support was crucial for addiction recovery, but it had to be the right kind of support. Unconditional love didn't mean unconditional acceptance of destructive behavior. David needed to experience the natural consequences of his actions while knowing that redemption was possible through consistent, sustained change. What about his relationship with Emma? He's desperate to repair that. David needs to accept that reconciliation with Emma may not happen, or may take years if it does happen. His recovery can't be dependent on her forgiveness. He has to get healthy for himself, not as a strategy to win back his daughter's trust. This was probably the hardest lesson for David to learn. His guilt about hurting Emma was so intense that he wanted to focus all his energy on making amends to her, but that approach could actually impede his recovery if it became another form of obsession. "I've suggested that David write Emma one final letter," Dr. Martinez continued, taking full responsibility for his actions, explaining his commitment to recovery, and then giving her space to decide whether and when she wants any contact. After that, he needs to focus on his own healing. How is he doing with the gambling abstinence? Very well, actually. David has been sober from gambling for 8 weeks now. He's installed blocking software on his devices, closed all his trading accounts, and transferred control of his business finances to his accountant. He's also attending Gamblers Anonymous meetings twice a week. The practical steps David had taken to prevent relapse were encouraging. Addiction recovery required more than willpower. It required structural changes that made impulsive decisions more difficult to execute. What about his financial situation? He mentioned being behind on several payments. That's improving slowly. David has developed a strict budget with his accountant's help, and he's been making minimum payments on all his debts while focusing on keeping the business operational. It will take time, but he should be able to avoid bankruptcy if he maintains his current trajectory. After I met with Dr. Martinez, I felt more optimistic about David's prospects for recovery. He was taking the right steps, working with qualified professionals, and showing sustained commitment to change. But I also understood that recovery was a long-term process, measured in years rather than months. Meanwhile, Emma was dealing with her own challenges as her senior year progressed. The financial stress of her father's theft had forced her to take on additional work hours, which affected her grades and her college preparation. She was still planning to start college in the fall, but the experience would be different from what she'd originally envisioned. "I used to think college would be this exciting adventure where I could focus entirely on learning and meeting new people," Emma told me during one of our regular phone calls. "Now it feels more like an obstacle course I have to navigate while working part-time to cover expenses Dad should have been helping with." Are you having second thoughts about starting this fall? You could take a gap year, give yourself more time to save money, and process everything that's happened. I've considered it, but I think staying busy with school will be better for me than sitting around thinking about Dad's betrayal for another year. My counselor agrees that moving forward with my original plans is probably healthier than putting my life on hold. Emma's decision to pursue college despite the financial challenges, demonstrated remarkable maturity and resilience. She was refusing to let her father's mistakes derail her own future, even though those mistakes had made her path more difficult. 3 months after my initial conversation with David, he called me with news that was both encouraging and terrifying. Emma had finally responded to one of his letters. She didn't call or text, David said, his voice trembling with emotion. She sent a handwritten letter to my office address, 3 pages, front and back, explaining exactly how my actions affected her. What did she say? She was brutally honest about the damage I caused. Not just the financial damage, but the emotional trauma of realizing the person she trusted most in the world had lied to her and stolen from her. She described feeling stupid for not seeing the signs, angry at herself for defending me to her mother, scared that she couldn't trust her own judgment about people. David's voice broke as he recounted Emma's words. Hearing his daughter's pain described in her own terms was clearly devastating, but also probably necessary for his continued recovery. Did she say anything about the possibility of reconciliation? She said she doesn't know if she'll ever be able to trust me again, but she's willing to consider limited contact if I can prove through my actions that I'm truly committed to recovery. She set very specific conditions. What kind of conditions? First, I have to complete at least 6 months of gambling addiction treatment and provide her with documentation from Dr. Martinez confirming my progress. Second, I have to develop a concrete plan for repaying the money I stole, with a realistic timeline and accountability measures. Third, any future contact has to be on her terms, at her pace, with no pressure from me for more communication than she's comfortable with. Emma's conditions were reasonable and showed sophisticated thinking about what genuine amends would require. She wasn't asking for impossible gestures or demanding immediate trust. She was establishing clear benchmarks that would allow her to evaluate her father's sincerity over time. How do you feel about her conditions? Grateful that she's even willing to consider eventual contact, terrified that I'll somehow mess up this opportunity. Determined to meet every condition she set, no matter how long it takes. Dr. Martinez warned me about this. Your recovery can't be dependent on winning back Emma's forgiveness. You have to stay committed to treatment and financial responsibility because they're the right things to do, not because they might earn you a relationship with your daughter. I understand that intellectually, but emotionally, the hope of reconciling with Emma is what gets me through the hardest days. Is it wrong to be motivated by the possibility of repairing our relationship? The question David posed was complex, touching on the fine line between healthy motivation and potentially destructive dependency on external validation. I thought carefully before responding, knowing that my answer could influence his approach to recovery. It's natural to want to repair your relationship with Emma, I said. But there's a difference between being motivated by hope and being dependent on a specific outcome. Your recovery needs to be strong enough to survive disappointment if Emma ultimately decides she can't have a relationship with you. David was quiet for a moment. Dr. Martinez says something similar. She talks about outcome independence, doing the right things because they're right, regardless of whether they produce the results we want. That's wise advice. You can hope for reconciliation while accepting that it may not happen. Over the next several months, I watched David work methodically through Emma's conditions. He continued attending therapy sessions and Gamblers Anonymous meetings, maintained his gambling abstinence, and developed a detailed repayment plan for the money he'd stolen. His accountant helped him restructure his business debts and create a realistic budget that allocated specific amounts toward Emma's college fund each month. The repayment plan was ambitious but achievable. David calculated that he could replace Emma's $8,000 within 18 months if he maintained strict financial discipline and avoided any major business setbacks. He also established a separate account for this purpose, with his accountant as a co-signer to prevent any impulsive access to the funds. I want Emma to see that I'm not just promising to repay her, David explained during one of our weekly dinners. I want her to see consistent progress month after month until every dollar is restored. These dinners had become an important part of both our routines. David needed the accountability and support of regular family contact, while I needed to see firsthand that he was maintaining his recovery. We met every Saturday evening at a small restaurant near his house. Always the same time, always the same place. The predictability seemed to help David stay grounded. During these meals, I watched my son gradually transform from the broken, shame-ridden man who had confessed his crimes to me months earlier. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was consistent. David carried himself with more confidence each week. His eyes were clearer, his conversation more focused, his plans for the future more concrete and realistic. I've been thinking about expanding the business, he told me during one of our dinners. Not in a grandiose way like I used to fantasize about, but strategically. Adding one new crew, taking on a few more commercial accounts. The additional revenue would help me repay Emma faster. That sounds reasonable, as long as you're not taking on more debt to finance the expansion. No debt. Dr. Martinez and I have talked extensively about my tendency to use borrowed money for risky ventures. Any business growth has to be funded from actual profits, not loans or credit. This conservative approach was a marked change from David's previous business philosophy. Before his gambling addiction, he'd been willing to take calculated risks, using credit to purchase equipment or hire employees in anticipation of landing new contracts. Now he understood that his relationship with risk had been fundamentally compromised by addiction, requiring a more cautious approach to all financial decisions. 6 months after Emma's letter setting her conditions, David reached another milestone in his recovery. He had completed the gambling addiction program Dr. Martinez had recommended, graduated from twice-weekly therapy sessions to once-weekly maintenance appointments, and accumulated 6 months of verified abstinence from all forms of gambling. I'm ready to contact Emma, he told me, showing me the documentation Dr. Martinez had provided confirming his treatment completion and progress. She said 6 months of verified recovery was her first condition. I've met that requirement. Are you prepared for her to still not be ready for contact? Meeting her conditions doesn't guarantee she'll want to communicate. I understand that, but I have to try. I need her to know that I've kept my commitments, that I'm taking recovery seriously. David's second letter to Emma was different from his earlier communications. Instead of lengthy apologies and emotional appeals, it was brief and factual. He provided documentation of his treatment completion, outlined his repayment progress with specific dollar amounts and timelines, and simply requested permission for limited contact at whatever pace Emma felt comfortable with. Emma's response came 2 weeks later, again delivered to David's office. This time, however, it wasn't a letter. It was a request to meet for coffee at a public place near her college campus, with specific ground rules for their conversation. She wants to meet next Saturday afternoon, David told me, his voice shaking with nervous excitement. 1 hour maximum, no discussion of the past unless she brings it up, no requests for forgiveness or emotional reconciliation. She just wants to see that I'm actually doing better. How do you feel about those restrictions? Grateful that she's willing to see me at all. Terrified that I'll say the wrong thing and ruin this opportunity. The week leading up to David's meeting with Emma was tense for our entire family. David was barely sleeping, obsessing over what he should and shouldn't say during their limited time together. I found myself equally anxious, hoping the meeting would go well, but prepared for the possibility that it might be disappointing for both father and daughter. Dr. Martinez met with David twice that week to prepare him for the encounter. She helped him practice staying within Emma's boundaries, focusing the conversation on his current stability rather than past mistakes, and managing his expectations about what one meeting could accomplish. The goal isn't reconciliation, David explained to me after one of these preparatory sessions. The goal is just to show Emma that I'm a different person than I was when I stole from her. If she can see that I'm stable and committed to staying that way, maybe she'll be willing to consider gradual contact in the future. The day of the meeting, David called me both before and after his coffee with Emma. His pre-meeting call was brief and nervous. His post-meeting call was longer and filled with cautious optimism. "It went better than I expected," he said. Emma was guarded, but not hostile. She asked specific questions about my recovery program, my financial situation, and my plans for repaying her. She seemed impressed that I had documentation for everything, that I could give her concrete numbers and timelines. What was her demeanor like? Professional, I guess. Like she was interviewing me for a job rather than talking to her father. But that's probably healthy given what I put her through. She needs to see evidence of change, not just hear promises. Did she say anything about future contact? She said she'd think about whether she wants to meet again in a few months. No commitments, no timeline, but not a definitive rejection either. Dr. Martinez says that's probably the best outcome I could have hoped for. The months following David and Emma's first meeting were marked by slow, careful progress. Emma agreed to meet with her father again after 3 months, then established a pattern of quarterly coffee meetings with strict time limits and specific agendas. These weren't father-daughter bonding sessions, but rather structured check-ins where Emma could evaluate David's continued stability and commitment to recovery. During this period, I found myself serving as an unofficial mediator, though neither David nor Emma had asked me to play that role. Both of them would share details of their meetings with me, seeking perspective on the other's words and actions. I tried to remain neutral while supporting both of their healing processes. "Dad seems different," Emma told me after their third meeting. "More honest about his limitations, more realistic about what recovery actually means. Before, he used to make these grand promises about being the perfect father. Now he just talks about taking things one day at a time." How does that make you feel? More hopeful, actually. The old dad made promises he couldn't keep. This version seems to understand that trust is rebuilt through consistency, not through dramatic gestures. David's perspective on these meetings was equally measured, but more emotionally fraught. Each encounter with Emma was both a gift and a test, an opportunity to demonstrate his progress, but also a reminder of how much he had lost through his actions. "She's cordial but distant," he told me after their fourth meeting. "Like we're business associates rather than family." I suppose that's appropriate given the circumstances, but it's hard to accept that my relationship with my daughter may never be warm again. Recovery often requires accepting losses that can't be fully recovered, I reminded him. The fact that Emma is willing to have any relationship with you at all is significant progress. I know. Dr. Martinez says the same thing. But some days, I wonder if this limited contact is more painful than no contact at all. At least when Emma was completely avoiding me, I could focus on my own healing without constantly being reminded of what I destroyed. This sentiment concerned me because it suggested David was still struggling with the reality that recovery required accepting consequences without the guarantee of redemption. I encouraged him to discuss these feelings with Dr. Martinez and to remember that his healing couldn't be dependent on Emma's forgiveness. A significant turning point came during their sixth meeting, almost a year and a half after David's theft had been discovered. Emma had just completed her freshman year of college, funded partly by the money Jennifer had provided and partly by student loans Emma had taken to cover the remaining gap. David had been making steady progress on repaying the stolen funds, having returned $4,000 of the original $8,000. "I have something to tell you," Emma said to David during this meeting, according to what they both told me afterward. "I've been seeing a therapist who specializes in family trauma, and she's been helping me work through my feelings about what happened between us." David had tensed, preparing for Emma to announce that she was ending their limited contact or that therapy had revealed even more damage she had caused. Instead, Emma shared something unexpected. "I've realized that I've been holding on to anger because it felt safer than risking being hurt again. But the anger is hurting me more than it's protecting me. I want to try having a real conversation with you, not just these formal check-ins." "What would that look like?" David had asked carefully. "I don't know yet. Maybe dinner instead of coffee. Maybe talking about things other than your recovery program and my school. Maybe acknowledging that we used to love each other and seeing if any of that can be salvaged." This conversation represented a fundamental shift in Emma's approach to their relationship. She was moving from pure self-protection toward cautious re-engagement, though both of them understood that this progression could be reversed if David gave her any reason to doubt his stability. Their first dinner meeting was awkward but meaningful. Emma asked David about his current interests, his plans for the business, and his thoughts on books he'd been reading in therapy. David, following Dr. Martinez's guidance, focused on present-moment topics rather than dwelling on past mistakes or making promises about the future. "It felt almost normal," David told me afterward. "For about 20 minutes, we talked about a documentary Emma had watched for one of her classes, and I forgot we weren't just father and daughter having a regular conversation. Then I remembered why we were there, why every interaction between us has to be so carefully managed, and the weight of it almost overwhelmed me." "But you got through it without falling apart or pressuring Emma for more than she was ready to give." "Yes. Dr. Martinez has been working with me on tolerating difficult emotions without trying to escape them or fix them immediately. I felt sad about what we'd lost, but I didn't let that sadness become a demand for Emma to comfort me or forgive me." This emotional regulation was perhaps the most important skill David had developed during his recovery. His previous pattern had been to use gambling as a way to avoid uncomfortable feelings, then to use manipulation and lies to avoid the consequences of his gambling. Learning to sit with difficult emotions without immediately trying to change them was fundamental to his long-term stability. As David and Emma's relationship slowly evolved, I began to understand that their reconciliation, if it happened at all, would look different from their original father-daughter bond. They were building something new rather than trying to restore what had existed before, and this new relationship would necessarily include awareness of David's capacity for deception and Emma's need for protective boundaries. "I don't think I'll ever completely trust Dad the way I used to," Emma told me during one of our phone calls. "But I'm starting to think that might actually be healthier." The old trust was naive, based on the assumption that parents are perfect and would never hurt their children. This new trust, if it develops, will be based on evidence and patterns rather than assumptions. That sounds like a very mature perspective. Therapy helps. My counselor talks about the difference between blind trust and earned trust. Blind trust is what children give their parents automatically. Earned trust is what adults give each other based on consistent behavior over time. Emma's insight revealed how much she had grown through this traumatic experience. While I wouldn't wish such a betrayal on any child, Emma was developing emotional sophistication and boundary-setting skills that would serve her well in all her future relationships. 2 years after that first conversation with Frank in the hardware store parking lot, I sat in a restaurant watching David and Emma share a meal. Not one of their carefully structured meetings, but an actual dinner where they laughed at each other's jokes and debated the merits of different movies. Emma had invited me to join them, marking another milestone in their slowly healing relationship. Remember when you used to make me help with the landscaping jobs during summer breaks? Emma was saying to David. I complained constantly about getting dirty and sweaty, but I actually loved spending those days with you. You were a terrible employee, David replied with a grin. You spent more time talking to the client's dogs than actually working. The dogs were better company than you. You made me weed flower beds for hours in 90-degree heat. Their easy banter was beautiful to witness, but it also carried undertones of loss. These memories belonged to a version of their relationship that no longer existed, a father and daughter who had trusted each other completely. The people sharing dinner with me were different now, shaped by betrayal and recovery, forgiveness and boundaries. David had completed his repayment of Emma's college fund 6 months earlier, ahead of his original schedule. The final payment had been accompanied by a simple note, "This belongs to you." I'm sorry it took so long to return it. Emma had deposited the money into a new savings account, this one in her name only, with passwords David didn't know. I've been thinking about graduate school, Emma told us over dessert. There's a program in social work that focuses on family addiction issues. I think I might want to help other people who are dealing with what we went through. David's expression was complex as he processed this information. Pride at Emma's academic ambitions mixed with guilt that his addiction had influenced her career choices, along with something that looked like hope that their experience might ultimately serve some greater purpose. That sounds like important work, I said carefully, not wanting to either discourage or overly encourage Emma's interest. What draws you to that particular field? Living through Dad's addiction gave me insights I wouldn't have had otherwise. I understand what it's like to love someone who's made terrible choices, to want to help them while also needing to protect yourself. I think those experiences could help me connect with other families in similar situations. You shouldn't choose a career based on my mistakes, David said quietly. I don't want my problems to define your future. They're not defining my future, Emma replied firmly. But they're part of my past, and I can choose whether to let that past hurt other people or help them. I'd rather turn our pain into something useful. This exchange revealed how much both David and Emma had grown through their ordeal. David was learning to live with the consequences of his actions without trying to control how others responded to them. Emma was finding ways to transform her trauma into strength and purpose rather than allowing it to victimize her indefinitely.